Hello everybody, welcome back. And if you're new to this channel, I am Christina. I am a BIM specialist focusing on helping businesses with Revit training and integrating optimized BIM workflows that help them make the best of the software faster. I'm relatively advanced with Revit in general. You probably already know that Revit API gives you huge opportunity to automate practically everything related to your workflow or day-to-day modeling work in general. Past 5 years, myself, I have progressed from working with DYNAMO to working with Revit API paired with Python, and now heavily focusing on working with Revit API and C#. I can confidently say that C# and Revit API probably offer you the most sustainable way of building custom applications for Revit. And if you're looking to learn more about coding with Revit API and C# in general, make sure to like and subscribe. I guess it's time for us to move on with our first topic, how to build Revit ribbon from scratch. So let's move on to the laptop. Our task for today will be to create the template generated app. We're going to focus on the architecture panel that will contain a standalone push button materials and several stacked on top of each other pull-down buttons. What we're going to require will be a relevant version of Revit API, in my case 2020, and its corresponding Revit version, and of course, a convenient for us programming environment, in my case, Visual Studio. However, before we move on, it's important to understand one concept. What is Revit API or API to begin with? API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's nothing more than a collection of classes that represents each of the elements of the interface of the software you are working with. Usually, the class gives you the opportunity to create similar element in their interface or manipulate the existing one in a certain way by changing its properties, for example. So when we go to Revit, this ramp button is a standard push button. And our materials button in our template generator panel will be also a push button. If you go to Revit API docs, you can just go ahead, search for the class, and explore all of its members along with its methods and properties. All right, now that we understand Revit API to a degree, we can focus on its classes. And a class usually contains a constructor, a way to define it in our code and in the interface of the software. Methods, basically a list of functions that our interface element can perform, and properties, a list of characteristics we can tweak in a way to change the behavior of our interface element. Today we are going to focus on several classes, among which UI controlled application class that will help us create our ribbon tab and ribbon panel. And later on the ribbon panel class, that will allow us to add our standalone materials button and later on all the stacked items we need. And of course, we're going to use the push button and pull down button class, and respectively the push button data and pull down button data class. Speaking of buttons, it's important to mention that we're going to need images for our bitmaps, and Revit requires a very specific format for standalone buttons, 32 by 32 pixels, and for smaller ones, like the stacked ones we're going to create, 16 by 16. In general, there is a way to scale down any image you add as a resource. However, today we're going to work with already formatted images, and we're not going to focus on that as it merits a standalone video on its own, I think. Today, we are not going to focus on creating the optimal code for our purpose, but instead, we're going to focus on learning some basics about C Sharp. We're going to learn to iterate through elements with the for each loop. We're going to deal with some strings and learn how to concatenate them. And last but not least, we're going to learn how to create lists, which is one of the most common data structure out there. If you are someone completely new to programming, there is much to be explained about how you set up your programming environment and how you can set up your project. However, we are going to reserve that for a separate video. And today, I'm going to create a new project from one of the most popular Revit add-in templates out there created by Jeremy Tamick. Just hit next, and I'm going to call my add-in template generator. Just hit create. Once you're inside your project, make sure you have all the necessary references and you're using all the correct namespaces. Pay attention to the app and command files. In the app file is where you're going to create your tab, but the command file will be the place where you're going to create all the code that will give functionality to your buttons. Today we are going to focus on the app. So we can start by defining a string for our tab name, which will be template generator, and a string for our panel name, which will be architecture. You probably already saw that we have our first UI controlled application class already defined, and we can reference it to create our tab and later on to create our panel. Tab name and panel name. One thing that is also very important is to get the path to the code we are going to execute with our future buttons. Today, it's not going to be very important for you to get deeper into that, but we're actually going to use reflection here, and let's say this assembly path. Maybe let's make it shorter, this path. Actually, we need to declare it as string. Assembly. get executing assembly. And make sure to add location. And you're going to know where the code you want to execute with your buttons will be. All right, so it's time to add our first push button. But before that, we have to go through the push button data class. It's practically a class that holds all the data for your button, push button data. Mhm. And I'm going to use the constructor. The first string is the internal name of your command that you're going to execute with this button. Let's call it materials. The second one is the string that's going to appear on your tab, materials. The third one is the location of your assembly. So in our case, this path. And the last one will be the full name of the class that's going to be executed. In our case, for now, it's going to be just command. Template. And just include the full name of the app, generator dot command. To be able to add the image, we have to create a bitmap. Now we'll call it PD1, PD image 1. New bitmap image. And I'm going to use the URI and my source I will find in my resource folder that I added to the project. I'm going to set the large image property to the newly created bitmap image. And my button is ready to be added to the newly created ribbon, tab, and panel, which reminds me that it's good to create a variable for our ribbon panel so we can reference it freely in the code further on. Let's call it push button. Push button. One. we're going to use the add item method and just add the PD data one. It's important to redefine it to push button, and we can test it out. And we have our button. Before we move on with our pull down buttons, I think it's important to note how you can add resources to your project. In general, I had to create resources on my own, and after that, you have to use the add existing item option to add all the PNG files and JPEG files you require as resources for your project. Once they are added, make sure to change the build action to resource and do not copy to output directory. It's time to move on with the pull down buttons that are stacked. However, there are more than one, and it will be smart to use the for each loop, especially if we have a pattern when it comes to the naming of our resources. And what I'm going to create first is going to be a list, sorry, of strings. Pull down name. Name, let's call it new. And each member will stand for each pull down button. In my case, it will be first types, then fenestration, excuse me, you don't write anything here. So it's first going to be types, fenestration, interior, or actually MEP is better, interior, and we're good to go. Semicolon, and I will create a list of pull down data items. Pull down button data called PD data. And for now, it's going to be empty. I will use the for each loop to iterate over all the strings in PD name. And first, I will declare a pull down button data item. Here, I have to declare just the internal name of the button and the name on the tab. So I'm just going to use the existing names and I will concatenate command cmd So basically item and item. Next thing, I need a bitmap image. And frankly, I can just go ahead and copy everything from here. However, I will do a very small alteration. I will add item here and the type of the file, in my case, PNG. It's time to define the image property of the pull down button data element, pull down item. The image property, because all of these pull down buttons will be stacked, so you really don't need the 32 by 32 standalone image. We're going to reference here some names are called coincidental image, and I will remove the one. Hmm. And I should not forget to add the newly defined pull down button data PD item to the PD data list. Add PD item. All right. Now theoretically everything is ready for me to just add the stacked buttons. I just have to reference the ribbon and use the add stacked items method. You can stack up to 3 buttons. We're going to just stack 2. And we are going to reference each pull down button data just by its index. Right, let's test it out. You can see that we already have our pull down buttons, but none of them is active. And for a reason, we have one thing left to add push buttons to each of them. To make all of my stacked pull down buttons active, I need to add push buttons to them. Here I've created a lists of strings for each of them. And what I'm going to do is come here, create a ribbon item list stacked. That is going to be empty for now. And add all of these ribbon item elements I created with add stacked items. But be careful to use add range. For these push buttons, I will not use any images. So I will just go ahead and for each ribbon item, inspect, I will add the corresponding push buttons. Mm, mm, For each item. In sub element, mm, item, ribbon, ribbon item. Mhm. Actually, this is how I get the index of ribbon item. List of strings. Actually, for each string, I will pull down, will redefine the ribbon item as pull down button. Pull down button. And finally, I will be able to use the pull down button and its add push button method. But before that, I will need to create a push button. I will just use the syntax above, the code above. Mm, I will use list me, and here I will concatenate list.me to get the full name of the class. And I think we are ready to try out. And we have all of our buttons active with their corresponding lists. Congratulations, you made it to the end. And if you want to support me on my journey to creating more videos like that, make sure to like and subscribe.